I just want to say a little bit of introduction about the cost of living. It's 5 years we've been going now, which doesn't seem like... Only yesterday we launched back in Leicester. And it's really interesting to have these guys here today talking about the stuff in Calais, because it goes right back to the initial sort of setup of the blog, which was driven to some extent by a frustration with the time it takes to get stuff out in academic writing, the 2-year lag between something happening and writing about it and getting it published, and really wanting to get some proper sociological contemporary comment on current issues, and that's really something that underpins the blog. So it's really nice that we've got these two speakers here today to do exactly that. So we're supported by the MESOC committee. We continue to publish material on a weekly basis. If you're interested in publishing something in the blog, then contact one of the editors. If you want to give us an idea, we can do that. If you want to give us a fully worked up post, we can give you a comment back on that. We're really keen to publish guest posts, so please do get in touch if you have an idea. Yeah, and the blog continues to go from strength to strength. And today is going to add to that. So on that note, I'll hand over to Judy, who's going to introduce our speakers.
I will. And I'm just going to chair and introduce our speakers. And just to add, we're absolutely delighted that they could come. Both from geography departments. Thank you. So it's nice to have a bit of feeding into sociology of health from other disciplines. And also, given that we've talked quite a lot about things like globalisation and neoliberalisation across this conference, but actually very little work on those who are probably most vulnerable to those forces. So I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers who are going to tell us a little bit about a very nice piece of work they did on just that. So I'm delighted to introduce Surindar Dhesi from Birmingham and Arshad Isakjee from Liverpool, who are going to speak to their work for about 50 minutes, and then we've got some time for discussion and debate. So thank you both.
Okay. Well, first I want to say just thanks for inviting us. We're really privileged to have so much time to talk about our research, and I hope you find it interesting. It's very much an interdisciplinary project, and we started looking at refugees and migrants living in Calais in April 2015. And so it started off as a project that wasn't as good as it sort of became when Surindar was added to the group. The day after Dr. Tom Davies started Viva, so it was his Viva day, we decided that we're going to look to do a project on migrants living in Calais. I'm interested in migration, especially sort of diasporas living in the UK. Tom Davies is an environmental and social geographer who's interested in people living informally, and his PhD was about populations living along the Chernobyl exclusion zone informally without state provisions. So we started to get interested in this topic. Now, migrants have been living in Calais since the late 1990s. There's documented evidence that around 97, 1998, there were up to 200-300 people living on the streets of Calais. By about 2001, that number had risen to about 1,000, 1,500, and we had the old Sangat refugee camp. In 2001, Tony Blair and Jacques Chirac did a deal to basically split the migrants that were living there at the time between being able to apply for asylum in France or in the UK, depending on their family scenario. But since then, handfuls to then hundreds of migrants were living in Calais, even since 2001. By 2015, the population had reached about 1,000, and we'd planned a trip there in March and April 2015. By coincidence, the week that we arrived, migrants who had been living in forested areas, problematically called jungles, but also along sort of streets, under church roofs in the town centre. The week that we went there, they were all forcibly moved out. So this is an example, this picture, an example of a photograph we took in sort of forested area. We were only allowed in the forested area because we don't look like migrants and refugees as people. We're just walking around with our clothes are not particularly shabby. We've got sort of big backpacks on, with us and so forth. And this is an example of the sort of useful goods basically left behind: cooking materials, food, clothes, because they were forcibly moved so quickly. So it's another picture of sort of a carving made into a tree by a migrant. And the refugees were moved into this zone, this sort of abandoned zone, which became known as the New Jungle Camp. And there are 1,000 people living there. This is an example of a sort of shower sort of a makeshift shower that had been constructed just in days after they'd been moved onto the site. So yes, this picture, as I've already explained, sort of just shows that migrants have been living in Calais for a long period of time. And they used to be in the Sangat refugee camp, which was a sort of housed shelter, which was semi-formalised. Agencies were working there. So, just to give you a sense of what Calais is like, the black dots here represent all the sort of little makeshift camps that were, these are the sort of key sites that we saw when we were there before the new jungle site was created. So here you've got C, which is the centre of Calais. Then you've got the port area, where migrants might look to go if they're trying to get onto ferries and illegally cross into the UK. And what you've got at B is actually a housed reception, sort of an accommodation centre, which only houses about 200 people. That's exclusive to women and children, so that had been there for some time. What police wanted to do, probably because the migrant numbers were getting too high, politically it was becoming damaging, is that they wanted to demolish all the little small camps. That one actually lasted for quite a while because it was under a church roof, so I think the activists were protecting it for some time. And they were forced basically to live in that abandoned zone that you can see marked A. Now, if they basically tried to sleep anywhere else at night, so if migrants were found wandering the streets, they were literally taken in police vans and then dumped into zone A, basically, which is the new jungle, which was then the new jungle camp. Really interestingly, the southern half of the camp is actually a designated Seveso zone of moderate toxic risk. So when we were there, we found evidence that it had been used for illegal dumping. There are chemical factories along here, and so old industrial sites along here as well. And Channel 4 News actually went there a couple of months after us and found materials which they then took to a lab and found a lot of asbestos was basically dumped on the site as well. So it's it's a toxic space, officially a toxic space. Housing developments, for instance, wouldn't be allowed on that because it is a Seveso site. Okay, so, and you also had massive, and rapid population change. So it's 2015, it's becoming the sort of height of the migrant crisis. We're getting large populations crossing, especially through into Italy. There's sort of very large wave of Syrian migrants coming from the continental sort of side of Europe, from the east. Didn't affect Calais, we think, as much as perhaps the populations that were coming through by boat, when you look at where the countries that migrants in Calais were from. So March 2015, when we first went, population was 1,000. When we did the environmental health assessment, it'd gone up to 3,000, Surindar's going to talk about that in a bit. By December it was 6,000, and then by March the following year it was approximately 10,000 people. So it was a rapid population growth on a site which is about half a kilometre squared. That shows the sort of countries of origin of the migrants that were living in the camp, and that's just a sort of indication of 2014 and 2015 numbers of migrants arriving in 2015, which coincided with the rise in population. Now, we're obviously going to talk about environmental health and health ramifications, but we always get questions about why migrants would want to be in Calais in the first place. We have to emphasise that the numbers of people in Calais at the time were probably about 1% to 2% of migrants who had crossed into Europe. So not many, this kind of myth that migrants want to come to the UK, it's nonsense, not borne out by any evidence whatsoever. But there are specific reasons why these particular people, usually looking to claim asylum, sometimes not, might want to be in the UK rather than anywhere else. So this research was done with about 890 respondents by RRDP, Refugee Rights Data Project, and they found that large numbers of, so 23% of people had family in the UK, and that was the main reason that they wanted to go there. Language proficiency was the reason for 23% of the population as well, so almost a quarter, relatively proficient in English and see themselves as being more able to work there and build themselves a life. 14% friends in the UK, 14% said that they think asylum law would be favourable. Possibly a misconception, but as we might be aware of. So there are basically broadly three types of Calais resident which we found. So we're trying to categorise sort of different types of migrants and their stories. There were those that were seeking to enter the UK from the outset. So those are usually people who already had family members living in certain cities and towns. They know, some of them even knew exactly what roads they might find work on in Birmingham, for instance. So, so they've got those connections, and they think, okay, yeah, my brother lives there, or my cousin or my sister lives there. I can make a life there. Interestingly, they'd often be English speaking because they're from former British colonies. And there's some interesting conversations around, well, of course, if we're going to seek asylum, it makes sense to go to Britain. Britain was the sort of colonial country, and we learnt the language and so forth, which was an interesting sort of spin. Some were former UK residents who had previously been deported to places like Afghanistan. So areas of Afghanistan, for instance, are now considered safe. People might be deported. Some people had spent $15,000, $20,000 on sort of various smuggling fees to try and get back to the UK. And that's the general cost from that part of the world, and it's about $15,000 for people who arrived from Eritrea and Sudan. The sort of key countries of origin were Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Afghanistan, but there were migrants from other places, including Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, Pakistan. And some thought that obviously employment prospects might also be better in the UK, even if they had to work informally, that they could find some sort of work. A second group of people basically wanted to seek asylum in France, but were finding it difficult, either because they're not from the right place, or they were, authorities are not receptive, or they can apply for asylum, but it'll take too long to get any sorts of housing provision. So there's some people with basically papers demonstrating that they've been seeking asylum in France, but are waiting 3 or 4 months to find any sort of housing. So in the meantime, they'll be in a camp full of other people that they know in various social networks. But obviously, they wouldn't have been in the Jungle 2 camp initially, they would have been living informally in those jungles. That was expected to increase when, because crossing the channel was becoming more difficult. So more people in the camp were thinking, actually, I can't get to the UK, I'm going to apply for asylum in France, but waiting for housing would be, one of the other sort of reasons that they end up living in informal conditions. And then we have the institutionally abandoned, and this is quite an interesting group. Now, we all know the sort of Dublin regulations from politicians and the news media that migrants are supposed to apply for asylum in countries in which they land, but this system has never really worked properly. For instance, Greece and Italy are prime examples of this. They claim that they are victims of geography, and what they are almost certainly victims of is a sort of self-interested nature of the European Union. So northern European countries don't really want to share any responsibilities when it comes to migrants and asylum seekers. Therefore, Greece basically does not register and fingerprint people onto the Frontex system routinely. It's been encouraged to do so, but it usually does not happen. Because they know that the migrants and asylum seekers that arrive there don't want to stay in a country where youth unemployment is 50%. It's a poor place. They want to move on to places where asylum would be sort of feasible. In Italy, the Italian authorities had been very sort of strong-armed into making sure people do register. But this was happening inconsistently. And when it was happening, we found from the sort of evidence collected that people were being fingerprinted and therefore put onto the Frontex system, but then given no provisional housing, right? So they're fingerprinted, officially they're asylum seekers in Italy, but then especially we think if they're young and male, and this is backed up by Italian refugee rights groups, they're less likely to be an urgent case for housing. So they're living on the streets or sleeping in parks and being moved from place to place, and they're often actively encouraged by authorities to go to other European countries. The problem with that is once you are then sort of fingerprinted, you are unable to apply for asylum between 12 and 18 months in any other European country. So for 12 to 18 months, you have to live informally. Then once that period has passed, then you can apply wherever you are. So you're sort of, for that period of time, institutionally, I guess, abandoned by asylum law and process in the implementation, uneven implementation of EU migrant law. Okay, so initially we went in sort of March, April 2015. I went with Tom Davies at the University of Warwick. And as geographers, when we first went there, we had this sort of naive views of, we can ask people, how long they've been there, the journeys they've been through. We didn't realise that the situation in terms of living conditions would be so urgent. And as such, as geographers, I guess we were ill-equipped with the sort of skills to do a sort of a good, strong research project. Throughout the period of time that we were visiting Calais, we were in contact with Surindar, who was an environmental health scientist in our school. And that's why I'll hand over to Surindar, basically, who realised that by sort of combining our expertise, we could do something useful in relation to research in the area in a way that was ethical and productive. So.
Thank you. Okay. Right. So, what happened was this piece of research really was based on friendships between us, and over a period of time, we used to meet up for coffee and so on, and then when Tom and Arshad were in Calais, they were sending me these pictures, and I was thinking, my goodness, from an environmental health point of view, this is shocking. We need to try and document what's going on here. So we had, a very small multidisciplinary team where all early career researchers, we all just got our PhDs, within the last 3, 4, 5 years. And we applied for an ESRC impact acceleration grant of £5,000. So all of what I'm going to tell you has been done on £5,000 and lots of kind colleagues assisting us. So the University of Birmingham labs and so on have been extremely helpful. But this is really done on a shoestring, and I think it's a nice example of what's possible with a small amount when you're kind of determined and you have a lot of goodwill around you as well. So this is the Calais site, which is on sand really. And within the big site, we chose 11 sub-sites. So people were living in the camp really in groups that shared a language mostly. So we chose 11, pretty spread out. It doesn't look so much on the map up there like they were spread out. It looks like they were a bit clumpy, but it was as spread out as we could get them. And we tried to choose a variety of living arrangements. So some people were living in tents, some people were living in large groups in more wooden shelters and so on. So we tried to get a really good mix. And at each of the sites, we tried to take water samples, food samples, surface swabs. I did an observational survey of the conditions that the people were living in, observed how their hygiene practices were working, and we interviewed people as well. So we did some semi-structured interviews of individuals and of groups. Okay, so I'm going to run through the main findings with you. The details of these are in our critical public health paper, so if you're interested in knowing more, that's the place to be looking for the real details. But if I start off with food, people were reporting very often that they were hungry, and they were entitled to 1 meal a day from the Jules Ferry Centre, which is the centre that Arshad mentioned as a site of where the women and children were. There were also some kitchens in there where people could go and get some food. But we had reports that there wasn't enough food for everybody and they could only have this 1 meal a day. So what was happening was people were hoarding food and kind of mixing it up with donations and things that they'd managed to buy, and maybe eating part of that several hours later, which from a food hygiene point of view is not a good idea, because the period between 8 degrees and 63 is when the pathogenic bacteria will really get going and grow and multiply. And this setup here, this cooking over an open fire, we'll talk about air pollution a little bit later, but this was quite a typical arrangement. And you can see, people were kind of scrunched around. Let's show you some more photos. Okay. I can show you here. These are the containers that people were given the food in from the Jules Ferry Centre. And there was a lot of white bread involved and not a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables from what people were reporting. And this was like a shelving unit that we found in one of the kitchen areas in one of the sub-sites where people were living together, and you can see that they were kind of hoarding this food. And so when we looked for bacteria, we found evidence of the bacteria that you get that's associated with what we would call temperature abuse. So it's when you can't keep things properly cold or you can't really keep things properly hot. You have something sitting in the middle for a while. And we found levels of infective doses of these pathogenic bacteria. And by speaking to people, we did come across lots of reports of diarrhea, vomiting, fever, stomach cramps and so on, which makes perfect sense when you look at the circumstances they were living in. Okay. You can see here, people had been cooking and they had their utensils kind of lying around. There wasn't really anywhere for them to clean their utensils and their crockery and so on properly. So obviously we've got dirty hands, we're going to the toilet and so on. If somebody's ill, they're going to pass it on very easily to other people in these kinds of circumstances. Okay. Moving on to water. There were only 5 water points in the camp that we found. So these are properly plumbed in, and we think that the water within this system was probably okay, because normally there's a residual dose of chlorine in a main supply. But what we were seeing was some of these pipes had leaks, and where there's a hole where water can get out, contamination can get in. So this is a concern. And you'll see here, can you see this gentleman's filling up a water bottle? People were using these water bottles not just for drinking, but they were using other water bottles to wash after they'd been to the toilet. And we found quite a lot of fecal bacteria on some of these tap heads. And I think that's where you're getting this fecal oral route, where people are using the same taps for these 2 different purposes. And obviously you can see here there's issues with rubbish not being collected, and associated with that are lots of reports of rodents, so rats, mice and other pests such as cockroaches. Okay. So because there were only the 5 water points, people were going and collecting their water and putting it in whatever containers they could find and bringing it back to their sites with the kitchen areas in. And we found several people using these containers. Can you see there's a little hazardous sign here? Yeah? This was a water container. This was being used for drinking water, which is obviously a concern. But also you can see here the top's been cut off. So even if it wasn't a container that had been used for hazardous materials, it can't be properly cleaned, it can't be properly covered. It's not something that's suitable for the safe storage of drinking water. Okay, and you'll see here that we found quite high levels of bacteria indicative of fecal contamination. And I honestly think that's associated with this use of the taps and the water bottles and so on. Ooh, sorry. Okay. Moving on to toilets. This is a bit grim, clearly. You can see the water bottles reappearing here. Yeah. There weren't enough toilets for the number of people living in the site. We found 2 different types of toilets. There were 2 blocks of these portaloo type things that you would find at a festival. These are probably familiar to most people. Now these are emptied by a big lorry coming along and basically sucking out the contents. So for these to work, it's reliant on a proactive regime of someone coming along and emptying and cleaning them. And I did actually speak to the person who was cleaning these out, and he said, yeah, they're full up. When I come, they're full up. So, you know, there's clear evidence here that they weren't being emptied frequently enough. The other sort of toilet were what's often called long drop toilets. So they're kind of on a platform, you climb up your ladder, and then everything kind of goes through into a container below. But there wasn't any chemicals or anything to control flies or smells or anything like that in these containers, and they were not seen as acceptable for use by the people that we interviewed inside. So there are lessons here around, you know, you put something in, but you have to manage it, and there has to be user acceptability. You know, otherwise they're not used. So a consequence of these facilities is that people didn't want to use them. And they were going to the toilet in the open air instead. And there was a lot of evidence around the camp of fecal matter being trodden in and obviously trodden around, and we don't have the washing facilities to be able to deal with that properly. Environmental health is a glamorous profession. I can see I'm attracting you all into it. Okay. Obviously, I've discussed the washing facilities around hands, around toilets and so on. But there was a problem with the washing facilities for clothes and bedding as well. And there were big problems with scabies in the camp. And the NGO that we were working there was saying, well, we think there's about 20% of people here who have got scabies and we can't treat it properly because people can't wash themselves properly and they can't wash their clothes and their bedding at sufficiently high temperatures to treat it. So there's a real problem. And scabies is a miserable thing to have. You know, it's horribly itchy, it makes you feel dreadful, and it piles up on misery on top of everything else. Okay. We also had to go at measuring the air quality while we were there, and we found levels of particulates, 2.5, which are very, very tiny, tiny particulates that can get very deep into your lungs and cause respiratory problems and other problems as well. And we found levels well in excess of the WHO recommended levels. And this is quite typical. I mean, people were getting upset about the amount of rubbish lying around the site, so they were setting fire to it to tidy up, but also to keep themselves warm and for food and so on. And I don't know if you know when it's coming up to kind of bonfire night time, you know that kind of smell in the air that's bonfire night? That's what that camp smelled like to me. And you know, when we left at night, we were feeling quite wheezy ourselves, our clothes were smelling of smoke and so on, and it was generally an unpleasant place to be. Okay. In terms of shelter, people were living in a mixture of different conditions. So some of them were lucky enough to be living in tents which had been donated, so you know, reasonably robust structures which weren't leaking. Other people, as you can see here, had used, can you see there's a branch, yeah, from a tree that they'd found. They'd kind of cobbled together structures with branches or maybe donated timber, and they'd kind of put these tarpaulins that people had donated to them over the top, yeah. So out of our 11 different sites, there were an awful lot who reported having leaks, having, you know, stuff that was really quite rickety and it didn't feel very safe in windy or very rainy conditions. And a big problem was people reporting being very cold at night. And what comes with that is condensation. Obviously, you know, you will know yourselves if you've camped in a tent and you wake up in the morning and it's all a bit soggy. But if you're living in these conditions day after day, you don't really have a chance of drying out, you know, and it's pretty cold and miserable. Okay. So, as well as these kind of, you know, the physical conditions, we also found that people had quite a few injuries. We found quite a lot of burns, obviously associated with these fires. And we also found, you know, people had kind of fallen over. Someone fell off a bike when we were there, didn't they? And raised all their hands up. So there were injuries happening from being in the camp and the way that they were trying to live in the camp. But there were also injuries involved with trying to make their way to the UK as well. So people being injured trying to board trains, for example, or trying to jump on lorries. And we also had reports of people being beaten up. So you remember when I showed you at the beginning where all the sites were on that plan? Some were in the middle and some were kind of along the edges. And that was an active decision amongst the people living in the different groups. So the people living in the middle were the Kurdish people, and they were saying, we like being here, we're tucked away, no one really knows we're here, no one really bothers us. But then they were very hungry and they weren't benefiting from the donations that members of the public were coming and bringing into them. Then we have the people, the Sudanese people who were living along the edge of the camp, and they were benefiting quite well from the deliveries that were coming in, but they were reporting getting beaten up in the night by who they thought were local people, folks coming and duffing them up in the night, and obviously they didn't know who they were and they disappeared off again. So lots of different physical injuries with different physical causes. And then obviously we have the mental health side of things as well. So although our emphasis was on the physical side, we did see evidence of people who had self-harmed, who reported feeling suicidal. And this is just one quote from a man from Afghanistan that I spoke to, and he was saying, I'm starting to think that actually a bullet through the head in my home country would have been better than this, because this is no life. I'm dying here, but it's a slow dying. And you can kind of see from these conditions that would be the case. I'm just going to quickly whiz through with you. So that was Calais when I went with Tom and Arshad. And then I managed to get a little bit more funding to look at the Dunkirk camp, which is about an hour away from the Calais camp. And both camps have since been destroyed, but I managed to get into here very shortly before it was destroyed earlier this year. So it's a bit of a contrasting situation, but there's still some problems with it. So you can see here, it's much more of a formal camp. There's proper wooden structures here, so people are generally living inside some kind of structure. And whereas in Calais there were problems with fire, because these structures were quite flammable and they were on top of each other, and there was no firefighting equipment and no routes through easily for firefighting services to come. Here you can see it's kind of on hard standing, and there's reasonable-ish gaps between the camps. They're not all attached to each other, between these huts, sorry. You can see here that there's at least some kind of common lighting, so people weren't having to use naked flames so much. People had little battery-operated stuff in their huts. Now within these huts, I didn't see one stick of furniture. Empty, empty, empty. And each one would have a family, often of 5 or 6 people, including children. Normally blankets on the floor, blankets on the walls. We're trying to keep warm. Okay, this is just another picture, so you get more of an idea of what these cabins were like. I understand that they were built with some kind of insulation, but they got too unbearably hot in the summer, and so the people that were living in there in the summer pulled all the insulation off. And of course that's caused problems in the winter. I was there when it was really pretty cold. And I would say, although the conditions here were a lot better, plumbed-in toilets, proper showers and so on, the atmosphere was very threatening. Calais felt, I didn't feel frightened there. I don't know about you, I didn't feel frightened in Calais, but here I felt nervous. And some of the people I spoke to said there's mafia here, there's guns here, it's not a nice place to be at all. Yeah. Okay. A couple of the bigger issues here were people given log burners in these communal kitchens, and what had happened, they were built, as I understand it, fairly open air, so roof on top, quite open sides, because if you obviously need that for your burning wood. And then because there was such a shortage of accommodation, these walls were put on, and so you've got log burning going on inside, and people sleeping in this very sooty atmosphere. You can't really see that. It's basically, this says, my life in the camp is really bad, please help. And I can well understand why they would feel like that. It wasn't, I went twice and it wasn't a nice place to be at all, even though physically the conditions were better. So you can see here, we've got these blankets all around on the floor. Yeah, this was really common. And these, because people were very cold, they were given these paraffin heaters. Everyone I went in had these paraffin heaters. Now, you'll probably know when you have combustion, that uses up the oxygen in the air, and you can finish up with carbon monoxide. And carbon monoxide poisoning can be fatal, but it tends not to come with any symptoms necessarily. It doesn't smell of anything. You won't know that this is happening until you're in trouble. And on one of the trips I went to there, there had been reports of various people being affected, and a family with children finishing up in hospital just a few days before from carbon monoxide poisoning. Because people are cold, they have these things on, and they block up, you know, obviously all the little vents in these kind of shed things, so you're not getting the fresh air coming in, and you have the problems with the carbon monoxide. And another side of it is that you have these real serious problems with mold growth because it's damp. These are damp, and the water in the air is condensing on these basic plywood surfaces, and this wasn't uncommon. This level of mold growth wasn't uncommon, and obviously we have respiratory problems that are associated with that as well. So as I say, both camps gone. Now on the day, well, one of the visits that I went to the Dunkirk camp, I went with an NGO. I didn't go as a researcher as such. I went in as a volunteer. There were guards on the gate, and I just went in as a volunteer, although the people in the NGOs knew that I wanted to kind of document the conditions. And we decided on the way out to pop by and have a look at what the Calais site was like, because we'd heard that it had been demolished, and we just wanted to go and have a look and see what was happening. And this is it, gone. And it was really eerie. It was very eerie, there was nothing there. And as we drove in, there were a few carloads of us. As we drove in, we saw someone in plain clothes walk and leave the site. And we thought, that's a bit funny, it's a fun place to hang around here, you know, it was really cold, it was freezing cold. And after a few minutes, we saw, I don't know, it must have been about 5 or 6 of these, you know, these police vans, like minibus police vans. In Essex we call them meat wagons, but these police vans came and they surrounded us, and the policemen had guns and they took away our passports. And they gave us a good fright, I would say, for a good half an hour. They really, really don't want anybody going anywhere near this site, which is kind of an interesting thing. There's a real nervousness around these sites, so far as I can see. But then when you look at the news reports now, we still have people living in this area, as they have been for a long period of time. And I'm keen to go back and, you know, see what's happening. Back to Arshad.
So it's worth mentioning that I think the sort of political strategies that underlie the sort of the action, and basically the inaction of provision in Calais and to a certain degree Dunkirk, but also in other places in Europe, is to basically push migrants back along their pathways of expulsion. You know, that's the strategy basically, to make life so difficult there that actually they want to leave, or they have no intention of going on to the UK. In fact, they actually want to head backwards. And in some parts, we've done research recently in Serbia. I mean, that strategy is working. To some degree, people are considering sort of heading back because there are no options. So, as a sort of geographers and human geographers and sociologists, we wanted to sort of conceptualise what was happening in Calais. And I think it's important to know that, that all of these things are sort of acts of violence. So France is the world's 5th biggest economy, and really, 10,000 asylum seekers, even at the height of the sort of, the camp size, isn't all that many. And yet, the provision of only 1 meal a day, which was only reaching probably a maximum 2/3 of the population. Most of the population didn't have access to that. You had to queue for hours, leaving all your possessions behind. It was a completely unpoliced state, so there was absolutely no safety. About 95% of the population were male, but for those people, for females in the camp that couldn't, get a space in this sort of closed-off centre, there were reports of sexual harassment and sexual assault, which would happen when you have a population of around 10,000 people. And there were local authorities obviously meting out physical violence. There was police violence as well whenever they thought they had to intervene in the camp. People were living there for between 12 to 18 months by the time that we returned in October 2016. There was a lot of drinking going on, especially among younger members of the camp. The local sort of, I think it was a Lidl supermarket, sold alcohol, very, very, very cheaply, and that was being drunk, and then people were getting into fights and arguments. So it was an unsafe place. But all these things All these things were acts of violence, but not just the direct violence. The scabies is an act of violence. It's the deliberate withholding of provision that leads to sort of scabies in an estimated 20% of the population. The hunger is an act of violence because the provision of food is easy, and yet it's restricted. The food was provided, in fact, by a nominal charity, but that charity is basically an arm of the French state, and they're deliberately only providing one meal a day. They don't accept donations. So it's a very deliberate strategy on the part of the French state to discourage migrants from being there, through that very stark form of biopolitics, really. The smoke inhalation, the asbestos fibers, which people were inherently sort of, inhaling, the sort of loss of possessions when fires would spread through a camp, which is obviously flammable and there's no fire protection whatsoever. All of these are forms of violence and of structural violence. So we use this sort of notion of structural violence, which is I suppose well known. Galton wrote about it back in 1969. So structural violence, for Galton, is underpinned by social norms, and in a way that makes it more dangerous than direct violence. Someone was to mete out direct violence. Someone in this room was to punch another person in the face. Please don't do that. But everyone else would stand up and would challenge it because it's against any sort of social norms. But there are social forms of violence which are more intractable because they're sort of so common that we're used to people having less rights than others. And those become embedded in society and become more intractable. So as Galton says, structural violence is silent. It's essentially static. In a static society, personal violence will be registered, but structural violence is seen as natural as the air around us. There are people also who talk about stealthy and slow violence. I think that's quite relevant to what was happening to migrants living in Calais for any period of time. Rob Nixon, who writes about violence in relation to climate change, says that climate change can be a form of slow violence, but I think it's very sort of translatable to situations like these, of violence that occurs gradually and out of sight. There's no drama, there's no great drama in someone, gradually picking up scabies or over a period of time becoming hungry. It's not a sort of, there's no sort of video footage you can show of that happening in sort of an instantaneous fashion. But that delayed destruction is dispersed over time and space, and attritional violence that's typically, again, not viewed as violence at all. And Tanya Lee, would go further and say, talk about letting die. And I think this is very relevant when you think about what happens with the suspension of rescue ships in the Mediterranean, for example. Letting die is not an apocalypse. It's not like a massacre. It's a stealthy violence that consigns large numbers of people to lead short and limited lives. And I think that there's something also to be said here about sort of about what we consider to be violence and exclusion in modern nation states. I always like that notion of the sort of Foucauldian flip. So Foucault says that basically in pre-modern sort of nation states, populations that were not welcome were basically made to die, and other people were let live. And that's how citizenship worked. You're allowed to be here. You're not allowed to be here. It was brutal. That's what it was. But in the modern nation state, with all the sort of advances that we have in terms, economically, socially, politically, and so forth, citizenship is no longer conferred in that way. Citizenship is conferred through all the rights and privileges and provisions that we're entitled to. You can't be a full citizen of the UK if suddenly, someone tells us we're not entitled to education, we're not entitled to health, or safe living standards, a roof over our head, legal due processes, and so forth. And so we've gone from sort of make, die, and let live to make live and let die. So exclusion happens through the denial of those things, which allows us to be full citizens. And in these circumstances, inaction rather than political action can be used as a means of control. It's that withholding that can be so pernicious and enact that structural and slow violence on excluded bodies. I just want to sort of end with some more sort of recent sort of work that we're doing on the EU borderlands, because I think Calais no longer exists as a camp. What we have got is hundreds of asylum seekers living in other parts of northern France. It's just transported in inverted commas the problem. So if you travel sort of 50 miles south, I think last year we went to Nord-Fontaine and there were about 350 people living in a forest, all of Sudanese origin, along the motorway sort of lay-by, which wasn't on the news. Ethically, it's also really interesting as well. I mean, there'd be no benefit in us writing about that. There's no benefit for the migrants living there who want to be sort of, the authorities know they're there. The authorities don't want this to be on the news because it puts political pressure on for them to do things. The migrants don't want them to be there because they know that the only political action that's probably possible is the camp will be destroyed and they'll have to move on again. So there's no real value in discussing it after Calais sort of lasted for 18 months. There was a sort of, a lot of reportage, but not much in terms of, what happened to people afterwards. There was some limited rights to apply for asylum for some of the people living in the camp, but not for others. And, we all know about failures of the Dove scheme. Migrants who wanted to come to the UK to reunite with families, it really hasn't ended up happening at all. But these sorts of camps are becoming a sort of feature, especially around the European sort of EU fringes. So this camp here is sort of on the Hungarian-Serbian border, I think it is. This is a picture. This is from our recent research in Serbia, which is on the old Belgrade railway station, which until I think February this year housed 1,500 people, right behind sort of the main train station of the capital city. We went to a place on the Serb-Croat border, which is also the border of the EU. Serbia is not in the EU, and it's the border of the Schengen zone. And I think that it's when you go along these zones that you see really the hard border of the EU operating in a very direct, violent way, which is not necessarily, it's not quite as apparent in France, although also it was very stark. And that's, I guess, the reality. The border zones that you see there in Bulgaria, along Hungary, and as you enter Croatia. So you see migrants basically not at all being allowed to apply for asylum. They will literally get taken to police vans and dumped outside the EU again. The migrants, to be fair, have very little truck with Serbian authorities. Serbia is not in the EU. Serbia doesn't have that sort of role as the EU's border enforcement agency, which Croatia, Hungary and Bulgaria are allowed to do. And I think that it's interesting that in a way we're exporting those border controls to states where I suppose human rights legislation might not be quite as strong. And I think more importantly for political agencies and governments, the coverage of things happening in those areas isn't as sort of visible as it would be if it was happening literally in France, in sort of northern European wealthier countries. And I think that it speaks. We wrote this in the Antipode before we went to sort of Serbia, so this was published earlier in the year. As the violent ramifications of the EU's border work continues to be offshored and outsourced, and you can see that in Libya as well, outside Europe altogether. Be externalised beyond its traditional violent borders. It's all the more important to also look inside EU sovereign space to examine stealthier forms of structural violence that are hidden in plain view. More often than not, this internal brutality is concealed behind a veil of inaction and the withholding of the means of life. Okay. So, some concluding thoughts, Surindar, do you want to sort of quick slide? Or?
Yeah. Well, we were mulling over, what are the things that we want to finish up with here, and what are the messages that we'd like to get across and the questions that follow really. And we thought the first thing was that there is a strength in interdisciplinary working, which, it's what you will do as well. But I think this project is kind of stronger than the sum of its parts. So yes, I can deliver the environmental health side of things. I can tell you what is wrong in this camp and who's going to get ill as a result and what's happening. So I can do a physical survey and have some understanding of the literature around health and inequalities and so on. That's what my PhD was on. But the human geography element that gives us that really deeper understanding around violence and exclusion and so on. This to me is a whole different layer that we get by working together as a team. So I think the message around that is, don't be scared of working in an unusual combination. We're not an obvious fit, although, often human geographers are interested in health. It wasn't an obvious fit. But I think it's been a good balance because we've managed to have the physical, the empirical evidence of what is wrong in the camp and the deeper contextual understanding of actually what does this mean on a bigger scale. But what is connected with this interdisciplinary working is that it's not always easy. You have to give each other space and time as well, and there has to be a respect for others' knowledge and views and opinions. I mean, we had a lot of debates about ethics, for example, didn't we? And around health and safety. That's my thing. My background is I was a health and safety inspector for quite a while for Birmingham City Council, so I was quite hot on the health and safety, and the human geographers were not quite so fast. So, it's not always easy, and you do need to be respectful of others' opinions and views and expertise. And I think because, as I said before, it was based on, a friendship really to start with, that was easier for us. And I also think there were benefits of that because, this wasn't an easy piece of research to do. We all had our sad moments. And it's okay to be sad around people that you feel comfortable with, and I think that was a huge benefit, actually. And because we stay in touch and we talk over these things, that helped us deal with how we felt afterwards as well. So speaking for myself, maybe more than the others with number 3 up there, is that I have a practitioner background, so I was an environmental health practitioner for 10 years before I did my PhD, and I'm still an active practitioner. And so for me, actually trying to have some impact as a result of my research is very, very important. And I've done quite a lot of work with NGOs and volunteers who are working in Northern Europe to try and support the refugees that are living in that area. And I have asked myself a lot, what's the good or what's the thing that's come out of this research that we've done? Because we've shone quite a spotlight, and we've really documented the conditions in a way that I think is quite difficult to argue with. But we ask ourselves the questions beyond that. Well, what good has it done beyond that? The camps aren't there anymore. Some people hopefully are in better accommodation, but we know that some aren't. So there's always this kind of question mark. And one of the things I'm working on now is a project around volunteer welfare, because a lot of the people I met who are supporting refugees living in Northern Europe, they have normal everyday jobs Monday to Friday, and then they might give up their weekends and go and help and see pretty nasty things, and then go back to work on the Monday expecting everything to be okay, and often it's not okay. And I've been working with a psychologist at the University of Birmingham looking at post-traumatic stress with some of these volunteers, and it's looking like there is some evidence, people feeling angry and having flashbacks and so on. So, I think with this practitioner background, there is this kind of, how do I use it to the best effect? How do I use my skills to the best effect to kind of hopefully make a bit of difference as well? And number 4 up there really is, what happens next? What do we do next? This issue is huge, and it's not going away, and people are continuing to suffer on a massive scale all over the world. So, what do we do next? What do we do as researchers and as practitioners to use our skills to the best effect, really, I suppose. So if anybody's got any ideas, of what we can do, have we missed anything, any ideas for what should be done to follow this up, then we'd be very glad to hear them. That's it. Thank you very much.
That was an incredibly powerful account, I think, of the value of interdisciplinary research and your skills for pulling all that together with such a small grant. I'm not sure we're going to be able to answer your what do we do next, and I think you've spoken to not just the limits of bearing witness, but also the kind of ethical dilemma of when it might not even be the right thing to do, even to bear witness, which is a kind of worrying thing. I'm going to throw it open to wider debate, comments as well as questions. But Richard, I can see would people mind saying who they are?
Richard Compton from Scotland. I just wanted to add a small observation. I went through Calais in the summer on a holiday trip, and it was very clear, that the exclusion and the bordering isn't outsourced. It's very evident as you travel through Calais port. So as you drive out of the port, the whole of the port is defended by double fences for some, maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 kilometres out of Calais, with razor wire on the top and razor wire between the fences as well. This must be enormously expensive, and so this kind of exclusion is very active, and it isn't simply outsourced to Southern Europe and so on. So I just wanted to add that little observation to it.
We did notice, I mean, at the time when we were there and we were mulling all this over and getting our results, we were looking at the newspapers as you do and thinking, my goodness, the amount of money that's going into these incredible defences that we're seeing people getting injured on, this nasty razor wire is horrible.
Yeah, I think the time when we did the Environment Health Survey, just about then, the UK pledged a further £10 million for fencing in Paris. So
and the newspapers were like, they were reporting, this terrible inconvenience to holidaymakers, that was the line really that was coming through, and very little on, oh goodness me, what horrible conditions they're living in and what are they running away from.
I'm just wondering whether there's any statutory obligation on the part of the French state to act upon the environmental health concerns that we've identified. So if you report that directly to them, are they obligated in any way to act upon that in terms of the health needs of the people in the town?
So, I mean, one thing, so we wrote a report before we did any of these sort of academic articles. So we did the research in July. I think the report came out in September, probably, so about a month and a half later, which was supported by Doctors of the World who were working in the camp at the time. And it got quite a lot of coverage. Guardian put it on the front page of the website, and Channel 4 News and BBC News covered it and so forth. We were both, Surindar's a full-time sort of teaching fellow. I was on a postdoc on another project entirely, so we're doing this in our spare time a little bit. So we translated the report into French. We got that paid for with £5,000, and we distributed to a few sort of activist networks. We didn't know what happened after that. I've been told, though, I had a sort of event at the University of Liverpool a couple of months ago. One of the speakers had come from sort of trips in France, Belgium and Holland, sort of where he works with migrants. He said that report had been used in a court case in Lyon, but we're not aware of the sort of full details of that. So he was aware of that and we weren't aware. So I think there's that sort of, we're not sure how it stands in terms of environmental health law in France. So
No, I haven't been able to pin it down. But looking, for example, being an environmental health practitioner in the UK, there is legislation that I would use to deal with this. It sounds awful, but there's legislation around being filthy and verminous. So, we have tools to deal with this, but it's not European legislation. And I haven't been able to really pin down, the public health legislation. But it must be, it must exist. It must, if we've got it in the UK. Do you know?
So no, I'm afraid I don't know. I just wondering, turn it round on you, Surindar. Say that camp was in Dover, and you were the environmental health officer for Dover. What would you do?
I would work very closely with the local housing authority, and I think it would probably be dealt with as a homelessness situation. But I would be able to deal with it from a public health point of view and basically serve notices and say people can't live, we cannot have people living here like this. And I have dealt with kind of similar situations in my working life as an EHO, but obviously not on this kind of scale. But there are people who live, in rough conditions, and we do have the powers to deal with it. Yeah.
Just to put in a small piece of information, directors of public health in designated port areas in the United Kingdom have a particular additional set of responsibilities as the medical officer to the port, and that includes certain powers to stop ships, move people, stop things happening, and determine that an area will not be used for any purpose until. So we have some powers that go beyond even the normal kind of expectation of what an environmental health officer would be able to do, but they're very often vested in the Director of Public Health for Liverpool.
Catherine Pope, that was grim, but important, and there's a bit of me that thinks I won't even attempt to answer the last question that you posed, but given that Judy's here, thinking about Judy's work, which for a number of years has been about doing work with vulnerable populations and working with them as participants to to tell their stories and to try and do things that make a difference. And there have been a number of public health oriented projects that Judy has done. I wonder what the conversation is between you about the learning from the kinds of stuff we've done with community development work and projects where we do participatory stuff, whether it's just that's too far down the line, because it's clear that there are huge basic public health issues that need to be dealt with. But is there a point at which we can work with the people to do something so that because it feels like a lot, I feel really disempowered by the activism, which is give a bit of money, donate a tent, and the people that go, I think you're amazing that you go, because I just think, God, you do that and your job, it's like, Jesus, how do you do that? But what can we do with the people, apart from, having a revolution and changing, which I always end up saying that's what we've got to do, but can we, is there the sorts of stuff you've done, Judy, with people, you talk to communities about the sociological problems that you're researching, and then the stories are with them, not just about them. And I'm not saying that as a critique, because I think what you've done is vital, but
this, sorry, not to interrupt before you answer, Kathy, but it might, because I really want to hear a little bit more about that kind of ethical dilemma as well, because to some extent, just people often say, yeah, you do the research, so what? But bearing witness is just so important, particularly when so many of these things are hitting you. But you spoke very movingly about there's an extent to which telling the story in and of itself might actually not be
possibly
harmful.
Yeah. I mean,
whether either of you want to speak to that as well.
I think the dynamic change. So we had 3 sort of key research visits to Calais. The first time was just myself and Tom. And when we went there, the sort of informal camp had just been set up, so no one knew about it. So when we sort of wandered in, and obviously, yeah, I mean that wouldn't have been sort of planned. We just got told that the migrants aren't on the streets anymore. They've all been moved to this site. And they allowed us to see where they were cleared from. But when that happened, everyone we spoke to was sort of, people must know what's going on. This is outrageous. We're basically semi-incarcerated in this space. Effectively we're imprisoned in this space. Is what they were basically saying, and so any opportunity to sort of get a message out there, and we thought, okay, I think we wrote a piece for the conversation, which was about as much as we could have done probably as academics. We didn't really have access to write sort of anything beyond that, and I thought, okay, we've done something kind of that's moderately useful, and then we ended up working with Surindar to do something that would act as advocacy, a project that would actually become a piece of advocacy, and that notion was that when we went in July 3 months later, I think that was. People wanted to, as soon. So I remember when we discussed how are we going to get are people going to agree? Are people going to give sort of informed consent for us to do it? And I think Tom and I probably thought, you need to build rapport, and then people trust you, and then. But actually, as soon as you say it's about health, it's about SEO, it's like in the word like, oh yeah, straight away they get it. It's like, of course, that makes complete sense. So actually, that was very easy. When you say it's about health, it's like, well, obviously, because the health conditions here are awful. That's the priority. And it was, but the year after that, it completely flipped, because then the camp had been for, so Tom was saying, I went with Tom sort of well far back, and we knew that the camp was sort of being earmarked for demolition. But we very quickly, what we basically did is we recorded all the security infrastructure that had been placed around it. We quickly realised that, we felt very awkward, like talking to anyone there. It's almost like, well, what are we doing? We're collecting data about how much. Everyone knows that the camp is there. There's nothing that they're going to gain from us talking to people and writing notes. I don't think realistically. I didn't think it was ethical to collect data from people there. I think by that point. So it was just interesting. So we basically spent time also trying to find and went to our frontiers and found the sort of splinter camps that are happening as a result of clearances that happen in Calais. So we found something out interesting, but sort of
We found, for me, this informed consent is really, really important. And so where we did come across something from the camp whose English wasn't sufficient to understand what we were saying, then we didn't pursue it any further, because they didn't understand the nuances around it, and we just felt really, I certainly felt very uncomfortable about it. We couldn't afford a translator, so we just politely said, I hope you're okay. But another issue really was making clear to people that change might not necessarily happen as a result of you speaking to us. You know, I'm not a doctor in the way that you think I can fix your hurt hand. You know, so it was about kind of making clear what our role was and being realistic around the expectations. And also being very, very careful about anything that identified any individuals, because it was really noticeable there. I mean, they knew exactly what was being discussed in Parliament. You know, the world is so tiny now with social media and the internet, that they were saying, you know, okay, I'm happy for you to, you know, document X, Y, Z and even take some photos, but I don't want my mum seeing me living like this. That was the, you know, the thing. They said, I cannot bear for my mother to see that I'm living, you know, in these conditions, so it's really important that, you know, you wouldn't see anybody in any of our photos that were recognisable. And so we did have to be careful, and we actually had a bit of a tussle, didn't we, with that filming man?
Oh yes,
Yeah.
So yeah, there were certainly by the time we did the EH study, there were journalists in the camp who I mean, obviously they don't have the same sort of, well, they have no consent standards. They were literally just walking up to people, sort of young girls, and just pinning microphones on, literally physically handling them and sort of speaking to this and sort of miking them up and so forth. And sort of a sort of like argument with someone who was doing just that, and then he was sort of insisting, yes, this will be in the Guardian, it will do something good. And it's like, yeah, it is. You know, so.
And almost adding to that layer of violence where people have got not even any rights over their own image and when it ends up. I'm about to leap in with chairs and rudeness and myself, but when you were talking about that, the kind of those layers of structural violence and the not allowing to live, what struck me as particularly callous was the calibration of the state, where there's one meal a day, there's an absolute minimum, but not enough, and that seems, I don't know why, but almost harder to hear than a kind of complete, you know, you don't want people here, you do nothing, but to do this carefully calibrated, not quite enough, just, I don't know why, it seems more violent in some ways, and I can't quite figure out why, but what was the kind of official justification for this one meal? It was to stop people coming, or what the justification
we
is?
contacted the charities, so we emailed them before we went on 2 researchers, and they never got back. You go on the website and they say they don't accept donations. So I think it was called Salam was the charity. But it was basically using state provision to provide a meal then. That's what all it would do. After the camp was demolished, obviously there's still migrant populations living in Calais and otherwise, because you can't, you know, it's just displacement. A lot of this is about visibility and invisibility, you know. The whole point of sort of getting migrants off the streets in the first place, I think, was a strategy to make them invisible. If you push them 2 miles out of the town centre, they'll be in this space, and you know, the people in Calais won't see them, and they'll become less of a political liability. But what it actually became, I remember the first time we went there, that first week that the camp was established, by the last day we were there, we sort of entering the camp, and there was a French farmer saying he's got a light plane, and for 60 quid he'll take any journalist over to do photographs. So, you know, if you want to take photographs, you know, 60 quid or 60 euros it was. So it was becoming a spectacle of horror. So it had the exact opposite effect. So suddenly it was, you know, highly visible in the news within 6 months. And then again, just demolishing the camp, the whole point again is to make it invisible. So it's just, you know, so it's that constant sort of visibility. So I forgot the original question now.
No, but that's interesting. Those kind of layers of I can't see.
Thank you. I have to start by saying that I come from Greece, so if we want to send the discussion with Greece, very familiar. It makes me wonder why do we call it sort of an immigration crisis for 1.5 million people. When you look at Turkey, they have 3 million. Jordan has 1.5 million. Lebanon looks like as big as Athens in terms of population, has 500,000. Now we are talking about 10,000. So I don't know what the crisis actually is, the real crisis, but it's very interesting how they maintain the crisis, because in modern politics, maintaining this kind of crisis gives unique opportunities for new policies.
Yes.
At the European level, at the national level, and also new kind of technologies and policies that are first being tested on this kind of people, and then move on across the society. And I think that's the message you might want to try to see, to get out, that if these things happen to these people, one day, this policy will move on to the rest of the population and come knocking on your door. It would also be interesting to maybe try to compare, because I think in Germany it's the other extreme example where it has become an industry. So there are now companies that I think the German state pays them and they provide full service. So they build infrastructure, places for people to sleep, food, security, everything. So I think it's the exact opposite. It's becoming a market with companies in the stock market, making profits by handling huge populations in so-called concentration camps.
Maybe. I mean, I don't know much about the sort of German example. I remember presenting this in Germany last year in Birmingham. So yeah, because I worked on a European separate project with German partners. And a lot of the German delegates just said this would never happen in Germany. That was their sort of message. I mean, I don't know how to sort of how to evaluate that. That kind of absolutely like this will never be allowed to happen here. That was their, the state would intervene and something would be provided. But I think I mean, part of the sort of political management is obviously because, and again, like you said, like the whole thing about framing it as a crisis, and I very much, want to emphasise, all the time that even of the numbers that come to Europe, this is a tiny percentage in France. And then, I mean, you're right, in terms of refugee populations, if you look there, they're in the world's poorest countries. The biggest numbers are in Pakistan, Kenya, Iran, and 3 million in Turkey, 2 million plus
I
in
was reading that in Turkey, in Turkey, since the crisis started, 200,000 children have been born in Turkey, which this whole thing, where you see numbers like 10,000, you know that there is a specific purpose, it's about maintaining the crisis for the media or for new policies and politics to, like suspending the Dublin system because of the crisis.
Yeah, well, and so the EU-Turkey deal shows exactly what the EU's interest was, because the EU-Turkey deal is basically that the Turkey will prevent migrants from reaching Europe in return for huge amounts of money, basically, and that's what I meant by the sort of offshoring that's also going on of migration, migration policing, basically in Libya. I mean, politicians are talking about actually sending, turning bits of Libya into a militarized zone to prevent refugee arrivals. To that extent, Europe is interested in preserving its effective, I guess, its racial character. I mean, that's what I think that is underneath that, but it's bubbling under the surface, and no one can talk about it. But that is, that sort of anti-immigrant politics is based on a racism that's bubbling under sort of the surface in a lot of European countries, more so in some than others. And that's what drives policy. And again, that's also what makes us very afraid of sort of framing it in terms of crisis and writing about it, beyond sort of the journal articles that I guess we write with the audience, I guess is a little bit different, but at the same time we want to have some meaningful impact as well.
Yeah, hi, Viola. I'm from Italy, so I have 3 comments. I'm going to try to articulate myself because I was very impacted from your words, and thank you for sharing. So one comment I was going to say, I think it's very helpful because I did a little bit of work just to look for migration across the Mediterranean Sea 2 years ago, and there was no data available about what happens once they get, they reach Europe, and then what happens next. And the only thing I could find was a work from the WHO that just did the risk assessment just in the island of Lampedusa. And then I was just going to comment on that in the terms of the money that having an infrastructure to welcome migrants entails is that, in the case of Italy, there's a big debate because it costs €35 per migrant per day, but it actually, people think that you just give pocket money to migrants, and it goes into the infrastructure service provider, and then the real conditions inside this infrastructure which are legal, as not as it's pictured. So there's a lot of similar problems going on, not at the same level of a camp, but I think it's very, it's a similar issue. A lot of people in a smaller space and not enough for everyone. And then my third comment was just to pick on what you were saying about working with people. And I was wondering if you had it's another question, suggesting about how you deal with the temporality of these people, because, they won't be there. So if you did start something, and then off they go. And so how do you, as a researcher, how do you deal with it? How do you move from stage 3 to stage 4?
I mean, we did attempt, didn't we, to do that photo elicitation. We were only in the camp for a few days and we gave out those disposable cameras, didn't we?
Yeah, but I mean, I was always,
It wasn't
unsure about that particular. I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know, in terms of activism, I think it's, I mean, my intention basically is to continue the research in Serbia with not very much funding. I just need basically to be able to get there and do things over the summer, which would then help, but I'm not intending to sort of do interviews as such. I'll probably keep an ethnographic diary, because I think that I personally, I speak from personal perspective, I think Syrindar's done a lot more in terms of working with activists and migrant networks, and I haven't, and I think that it becomes, that I think that you have to have a very good reason to interview migrants and audio record, let alone take notes. So audio record, I think that, so the recent field that we did in Serbia and Greece, I didn't record anyone, because I just don't think, I think what's interesting is what's taking place and finding out information. But I think that, I'd never, before doing this research, done activist-based research. So I do stuff into management of Muslim communities, governance of Muslim communities, counter-terrorism agendas, and I'm interested in governance, and often I write, about top-down governance and the way that works. But increasingly, I'm aware that the way I look at it basically is that in 3 or 4 years' time, I'll probably be writing from an activist research perspective, because I think that's the logical direction of the work philosophically, in terms of, I don't see what else can be said in terms, we can sort of catalogue all the structural harms that are taking place, but at some point the question becomes, well, what do you do to sort of, to have any sort of positive, I don't want to say sort of resistance, I don't want to sort of big it up as the more than, I don't know what the possibilities are yet, and working through that.
Thanks, guys. There is still, though, I think, a value in just, as you say, like bearing witness to it, and Tom's fantastic photographs, and just documenting it, because ultimately, like, these will be documents that people can look back on in 100 years' time. So we can see what this was like, and change won't come tomorrow, but it may come, and then there'll be lessons to be learned. So I think it's important not to suggest that you are, but to talk oneself out of doing this sort of valuable stuff, which is actually just documenting it, because those pictures will never be seen, and those sorts of, that sort of data that you collected from the environmental health work wouldn't have existed without you having done it. And I think there are oral histories and visual histories of other similar atrocities, which this is, that are still valuable now to be able to look back on and reflect on, if nothing else,
Thinking that way has been a comfort, actually, because you do feel, as I was saying earlier, what does this lead to, I've trained for years and years and years, and what good am I doing with all these skills that I've got? And I've taken part in like refugee awareness events and being on panels with refugees. But as you were saying, it can be traumatic for them, because often they're having to kind of relive their experiences, and they're often in tears, and they have post-traumatic stress often that manifests itself once they're in a safe place. So it can be quite difficult to do, and you don't want to be kind of sticking your finger in a sore place and making it worse for anybody. But it is a comfort to think, well, we've made this situation clear, and we've made a fuss about it.
I can imagine there will still be people who will see what you've done there and still think it's not a big enough problem for it to be dealt with.
Kathy, did you want to come back?
Well, just picking up on the activist point, as you were talking, I was thinking about like Gareth Bloom's and Jen Popper's work about lay epidemiology, and I was wondering if there's almost like a lay activist environmental health opportunity, that this is about engaging, this thing about what can the people do with our support and what could we equip them with, and thinking about the way some of that lay epidemiology work happened with communities that were concerned about environmental pollution and things. Is there a possibility that that's where the activism might go?
Interesting. I think, I suppose Tom, who's not here because he works as, he's a postdoc on the assay project on environmental harms of the oil industry in New Orleans. And that's exactly what he's doing there as part of his project, actually. which is working with communities.
On Twitter.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's exactly what he's doing. So I think that it's quite possible that we'll look at the possibilities of taking that direction with this work as well.
Yes, thank you very much. So from Birmingham as well. Of course, so state of exception and racism, which you flagged. But it makes me think as well about capacities and resilience of states as well and of the EU. So imagine natural disaster and thousands, hundreds of people would be displaced, citizens. So what France would do, for example, so in which conditions does that live? So it makes me think about it. So what do you think? So it can be your answer.
Well, in the UK, and you will know this,
yes, or in France,
the local authorities have a responsibility to have like an emergency planning function. So there is someone whose job it is to plan for all these different eventualities to the local population, and that's why I think it's an active choice not to respond to these situations, because they will have a plan to deal with their own population if they were exposed to a natural disaster. It's a choice. They will have reception centres and so on. I mean, even when I was working in the Cotswolds, we'd even thought through, what are we going to do with everybody's pets? It has gone right down to that kind of level. So I can't believe that, other countries in Europe will be any different.
Yes, sorry.
Hi, Arshad from University of Brighton. I just wanted to ask about your experience in Serbia, in the work that you're extending into. I know Serbia has had a problem with the Roma communities in Belgrade, for example, where they were pretty much the most sort of group of people that were homeless. How is this sort of new numbers of migrants arriving in the city sort of contributing to this problem they already have with homelessness and people being on the margins of society?
I mean, I don't know much about the homelessness situation. So the first research we did was this summer in August or July, and so I can only speak to the sort of the refugee situation there. What they've got, I mean, the overall treatment of refugees in Serbia by authorities, from the migrants' perspective that you talk to, and obviously that would be, you have to think about positionality, and they're sort of in that country and they're telling you about what life is like in the country, was generally very positive in the sense that they said that no physical violence from police at all, but physical violence if they go into the other countries which are within the EU. So if they try and make it into Hungary, physical violence. So if you end up in Bulgaria, consistent story, 6 months in prison, no child, no case, 6 months in prison automatically for being there. That's an EU country, you're not allowed to apply for asylum. Well, technically you are, but you're not really in reality. Same in Croatia. So there are child migrants also along the Serbian-Croat border. So we didn't interview anyone who we thought was a child migrant, but you see people and say, oh, he's 15, he's 14 or whatever, But they're trying to get to Zagreb to get to UN offices to apply for asylum. They can't. They'll get caught and they'll get dumped back because but whereas in Serbia, land has been given over to charities and activist groups in order to provide food, which is something interesting. However, the Belgrade sort of camp was completely destroyed, so the housing was destroyed there. But formal camps were then provided around the edges of Belgrade. I've got one contact, so I've kept in touch with who's at one of those camps at the moment. So the situation in Serbia is interesting. I was wondering, I mean, if I'm really honest, I was curious because the sort of evaluations of conditions in Serbian camps and the treatment by Serbian populations was seen as very positive by the people who were sort of there. But people have been stuck in Serbia for, again, up to a year. So we spoke to people who are literally trying to leave Serbia for a year. And I guess the Serbian population doesn't seem particularly sort of caustically anti-migrant as there would be in other countries because they're not, probably because there's certainly no narrative of them competing for jobs or any of that narrative isn't there, or trying to break into the EU, that sort of politics isn't there. Also, Serbia wants EU membership and has to evidence its own human rights sort of policing and so forth, so it doesn't abuse human rights. The irony is that from all the stories is things are much worse in other EU countries than they are in Serbia because it's not in the EU. So it's fine if thousands of people are camping out on the edge of the EU, so as long as they don't come in, and then it becomes a problem, and then it's then the hard policing takes place, and then the violence takes place. And there's tactics, things like phone smashing. So they'll get their mobile phones and smash it as a deterrent. So smash the phone, send them back to the border, dump them, leave them there. That's what's happening, and some of them have been beaten up as well. Bulgaria, like I said, 6 months in prison. Bosnia's not in the EU, but 6 months in prison there. If you're caught as an asylum seeker, a lot of people saying they've been in prison for up to 6 months in Bosnia just for being there, for no other reason.
Okay. This is powerful work. I thank you both for doing it and for coming to tell us about it. I am going to wrap up the formal part because I think we've kind of subjected you to kind of a barrage of questions and comments, and you've been stood there an hour and a bit now. Thank you. So can I, before I wrap up, just say, if you want to read about the environmental health impact assessment, that is the paper that they talked about that's in critical public health. And is it open access? It keeps kind of drifting in and out of open access.
It's open access at the moment.
It's open access at the moment, so this is your chance to download it and read it in full. Important work, and we thank you for doing it. So can we thank our speakers very much?